On the Super Nintendo, role-playing games have a tendency of taking place through the lens of people that exist in worlds far beyond our own reality. Heroes take up swords and shields and dwell in places in the past or the future, and very rarely do we get a protagonist that represents our lives as we know them. Secret of Evermore achieves this wonderfully by rooting itself in the late 1900s, a time filled with familiar sights and sounds. You play as a young man and his dog that begin their quest after stumbling into the wrong place at the wrong time. Many years ago, a well-meaning professor created a machine that could conjure up alternate realities that people literally dreamed up. Picture the ultimate virtual reality experience, except you create everything in your imagination and actually become immersed in it. Anyway, on the night that he was sharing his discovery with some close friends, all of them became trapped inside the machine and were never seen or heard from again. Many years later, our story opens with the boy chasing after his dog after a late movie and soon wanders into the professor's home. After some hijinks, the two of them are accidentally teleported into the dream world of Evermore with no way to get back either, and with no other choice, their mission to find the way home begins. While the premise for this game has a lot of suspense and mystery to grab new players, the storytelling in these opening sequences is strangely paced. The text whips by so fast you can barely read it, but more importantly, many of the scene-setting details being described are lost in some odd visuals. The entire time the boy is searching for his dog in the mansion, the camera's panning over the exterior of the building instead of treating us to the dusty and dilapidated interior of the professor's home. This diminished what was going on and made me want to see what they were seeing versus being on the outside with no way to look in. For a game that's filled to the brim with small visual details along with funny quips and references the rest of the time, looking back, this feels really out of place comparatively. The game's humor and writing were probably my favorite parts. The main character was very endearing and overflowed with personality versus some of the wooden protagonists in many other games. That fleshed out feeling also extended to everywhere you went in Evermore, since there were always some interesting jokes or banter to keep you chuckling. I reveled in this. If Secret of Evermore has a major strength, it's its narrative and character interactions that really set it apart. Over other RPGs of the time, it does have the enormous benefit of being created specifically for English-speaking audiences, and that's a rarity on the Super Nintendo. It's fun to imagine what other games might have been like with better localizations, but I digress. When you finally gain control of the main character, the game wastes no time getting started. You're handed a weapon from your faithful companion and are almost immediately thrust into battle with some of the local wildlife. Much of the game proceeds this way. You'll be catapulted to a new place and then explore winding action sections until the story lurches forward again. There's really no way to get off the path that the game lays out for you, but there are a lot of motions to go through and mysteries to sort out before getting through to the story thread again. Some legs of the game are easy enough, but one type of gameplay mode felt like an endurance match. There are these enormous maze sections where you have to choose a door or a direction randomly, and most of the time you're going to choose wrong and get shuttled back to the beginning until you work out the right sequence. Wrong paths also have enemies to whittle your health down as punishment for your mistakes. These areas were nothing more than an exercise in pure trial and error that required absolutely no skill and were merely meant to drain your resources. Other sections that let you wander freely used confusion tactics by making everything look way too similar, running you into dead end after dead end. I was actually surprised at how large these places were and consequently how nervous I was to miss something important. I know I left a few things behind because whenever I'd find an exit, I was so relieved that I couldn't convince myself to head back in for an item that I probably didn't need or wouldn't use. Every new region seemed to do something different than the last and capitalized on some new alchemy or other gimmick that wasn't always obvious in how it should be used at first. I got stuck and had a hard time figuring out what the game needed me to do a lot of the time. Sometimes I'd have to moosh my character into every inch of a wall to reveal something out of sight that I can interact with, or duck into hidden paths in the walls to reach a new place. You're always stuck thinking outside the box while retracing your steps, racking your brain over what's been missed, and this did feel unfair sometimes. In fact, on several occasions I thought I was stuck on a puzzle solution, but I'd actually gotten myself soft-locked instead, like this one area with the jail cells. Apparently this is a well-known bug, but I got myself into an unwinnable situation and had to reload to an earlier save. I had no way of knowing that except for someone in my stream chat that filled me in. There are many buggy aspects here, like this time that my dog warped into the corner of a forest and couldn't be retrieved without reloading, or another time where an enemy cast a control reverse spell on me that just never wore off. These moments were humorous, but I didn't like having to reload that often with the burden of making up lost ground from the last save point. At least when Calamity struck, there were lovely sights and sounds to enjoy in the different regions of Evermore. When the music was there, it was outstanding, but I was also surprised at how often there wasn't anything melodic to listen to. There's a lot of ambient noise and sound between songbursts, once again setting this adventure apart from others from the same time period. Even the graphics had a very distinct style. They're so far removed from the blisteringly bright backdrops and sunny character art in other RPGs. The locales are muted and moody, really striking some contrast with the funny tone of the writing. I can't say I've experienced anything quite like it before, and I liked both aspects very much. Given that this is an action RPG, much of the combat relies on close-range attacks. You can fight as the boy with whatever weapon you have equipped, or you can switch characters at any time and play as the dog. Apart from a few puzzly moments where you had to use one of them specifically, you could play as your favorite most of the time. An obvious omission here is the lack of two-player co-op unless you play a patched version of the game, but at the very least, you'll always have an AI character along to help. Several options to tweak the computer character's behavior and bring it in line with your own preferences are at your disposal. Secret of Evermore actually goes above and beyond by letting you customize so much of the combat experience that you would expect something seamless and tailored as a result. Even with all of the best planning though, enemy encounters were still a huge point of contention for me. That blame falls partially on the shoulders of the power meter and how clumsy it makes the flow of battle feel. If attacks are going to land any meaningful amount of damage, the bar has to be at 100% before slicing. In an action game, I get the allure of a strategy where every hit is calculated versus just wailing away on every monster that you come across until it dies. If this is done well, that's awesome, but there are a number of things that make Secret of Evermore's system feel dysfunctional. For starters, your weapons level up with use, and as they gain levels, there are more power bars that you can charge to unleash bigger and bigger attacks. This is good in principle, but in practice, it's a bit of a mess. You end up having to do tons of dodging and evading to charge up completely, and all that time you're vulnerable to enemy strikes. Your AI character can be off saving the day while you're huddled in the corner, but as someone who played mostly as the boy, I was sad at how weak the dog character was in early game. When his HP reaches 0, he just curls up on the floor and lets you get wrecked all by yourself unless you revive him between charging sessions, and this makes the battles even longer. I think what bothered me the most is how counterintuitive this system felt. Getting chipped away at by monsters while waiting to execute an effective attack goes against every urge that I have in an action RPG. I like to run in swinging and pulverize everything in sight in a timely fashion. The slow pacing bugged me so much that I didn't even bother to stack power bars very often. I even kept my AI settings to fewer charges to keep battles moving. It made sense to me to do more smaller assaults versus waiting around for larger ones that might not even get out in time before me or my companion died. Now, you may call me a nitpicker for griping about a core element of the game like the power meter, but there are a few more layers here that escalated my anger even further. If all I'd had to worry about was dodging enemies while charging up, I might have eventually embraced this system and gotten better at it with practice. The fights would be slower than I'd like, but at least I'd get to master a whole new kind of fighting strategy that I hadn't experienced before. Maybe even start enjoying it. This may have been a possibility if I could have landed blows to my foes once in a while, but the other major problem stemmed from the enemy hitboxes. I could not inflict damage on monsters reliably, try as I might. Even by the game's end, I had no idea where or when enemies were susceptible and constantly missed my targets. I quickly lost count of the number of times I'd charge up my attack, wait for the right timing, swing, miss, and have to repeat the entire process several more times before even landing my first hit. Things did get a bit easier when I got my hands on weapons that are thrown when they're leveled up a bit, but that wasn't enough to curb my frustration entirely. There are some enemies that don't even seem vulnerable unless you're using thrown weapons, like these flying skulls or their clones that popped up in way too many areas. It just shouldn't be this hard to dish out some damage. There are many other adventures that I've played through where taking on enemies is engaging. I've finished tough games like Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link or even Mike Tyson's Punch-Out on NES, where you have to strategize, learn patterns, charge in with confidence, and learn something new after each encounter. Secret of Evermore made me feel like I was always struggling, and even worse, that I was wasting time. While reviving my dog for the 1,000th time or waiting for my power bar to charge up, I was painfully aware of the seconds and minutes scraping by, and that's a pretty good indicator that I'm not having fun. This hurry up and wait battle philosophy was even more inane in boss fights, where the opportunity to land a hit comes and goes depending on their patterns. I actually felt bored, and even though the encounters were neat with lots of great animation and flair, the annoyances around charging weapons and bad hit detection completely snuffed out any excitement that I should have felt. Fighting felt like a burden, and in a game where you do a lot of fighting, it made for a very long trudge. You might be wondering why I didn't rely a little more heavily on magic. One of the game's touted unique features is a fleshed out alchemy system to take advantage of. Your trusty canine friend will sniff out ingredients as you travel, and you can pick them up and add them to your inventory. I don't know who made the ability to pick things up so finicky, but good lord was it ever tricky to find this stuff sometimes. My dog would be sniffing away, and I'd be clicking and tapping all over the general area for 30 seconds sometimes, or even more before happening upon the item. If there's some magical trick to knowing where to stand relative to your sniffing dog, I never figured it out. Anyway, as you collect these reagents, as long as you've previously learned a spell from someone and have it equipped in your menu, you can cast it. Like everything else, magic levels up with use, so if you want to have a high-powered fireball spell, for example, you need to be consistently casting it to increase its effectiveness. There's a major flaw in this design. In a similar game like Secret of Mana, you can whack a bunch of enemies, go back to an inn, have a snooze, and replenish your MP meter before heading back out to do some more spell leveling. As long as you have the inn fee, you essentially have infinite opportunity to work on your magic. Here though, you're limited by the number of reagents that you have in your inventory. If you don't have the materials, you can't cast a spell. In early game, even if you're discovering lots of ingredients or buy a bunch from a shop, there simply aren't enough of them to level anything high enough to be helpful. The big limiter really was money. Because I had such a hard time killing monsters to get cash in the first place, what little I did collect I preferred to spend on healing items or equipment for my boy and his dog instead of shuttling it into weak spellcasts. As a result, my magic stayed pretty low level overall, even towards the end of the game, aside from a few healing ones and some important buffs. Another bothersome aspect of this system is that not all alchemy shops sell every ingredient. As the game winds on, you'll run into more stores and you'll have to keep a note of where they were and how to get there, as well as what they're selling. On its own, that's not such a horrible thing, and some of my favorite games like Ultima 4 do this too. The thing that pushed me right over the edge into Rageville though was the issue of currency. Throughout your travels in Evermore, you're forced to exchange money for whatever's used in that stretch of the game when you arrive. When you're progressing in the linear fashion that the game intends, this isn't a big deal. But when the time comes that you can move more freely between locations, depending on the shop that you're buying from, you might not even have the right kind of money to get what you need. Then you have to try to remember where the money exchange locations are, travel there in exchange to the currency that you want, and then go back to the shop and buy your 3 ash or whatever the hell it is that you need to cast the stupid spell in the first place. The alchemy system is a really cool idea, but it's not well implemented. There are so many infuriating and overly complicated aspects to it that killed any desire that I had to be creative or even experiment with magic. As someone playing through for the first time, there was so little that I knew about the different spells and what would even serve me well in the first place. Many of them are actually found by exploring rather than being handed over at plot points, and while the potential to discover new spells might be a reason to do a second playthrough, there's no way that I could ever be swayed to play this again, especially for that reason. So I could add a few new spells to my list that I'd never use? No thanks. With more access to renewable supplies of ingredients, as well as eliminating the frustrations of money exchange in the late game, it would have eased some of the fury that I felt muddling through this mechanic. Even in the depths of my despair, Secret of Evermore's manual did make other aspects of the gameplay pretty smooth. It was an excellent resource that listed almost all the items, weapons, and equipment that you can either find or buy, and accurately described their function and stats. In a time when needing to buy a gaming magazine for help or relying on guidebooks was so common, it was a nice change to see everything spelled out in plain text. There was one section in particular that intrigued me, and that was the charm list. These rare items were must-haves in my opinion, but the way that you get them is one of the most daunting tasks I've ever taken on in a game like this. Many of them are found in this market, also known as Hell on Earth. It's not like your regular shop area where you can walk up to a vendor and buy whatever you like. Oh no, you have to trade. The barter economy is so complex that this part of the game alone took me hours to figure out. It's all optional, but I'm greedy and wanted to own everything, but also needed to spend the least amount of money to get it all. You see, different vendors want to trade for different things. Some people will exchange their goods for rice, others for beads, and so on, and half the battle is knowing exactly what's needed at each booth. Then you have to figure out who has each trade item for the best price. These aren't just straight conversions from your money to their commodity either. Sometimes they'll want several rice for one bead or several spice for 3 perfumes, but this is all to say that it was painful sifting through all of these conditions to even start forming a plan of attack. The icing on the cake here is that the market's physical layout is needlessly complicated. Parts of it are walled off by obstacles like empty booths, baskets, or other untouchable wares that exist only to thwart you. Some booths are only accessible by going through a building on a different screen first, as if it wasn't already hard enough to get around. They made this as nasty as possible. Not one part of this was easy, and frankly, I hated it. I don't use that word often in these reviews, and usually I can find some good in most things, but not this. It was around this part of the adventure where my opinion of this game really started to solidify, and I'm sure you probably have a pretty good idea of what I'm about to say next. Secret of Evermore is a well-intended train wreck of a game in its execution. No amount of good story writing or character development can make up for the atrocities committed by the combat and the gameplay. If even one of the major issues that I talked about here had been polished up even a little bit, it might have been tolerable. But to put it bluntly, this is the most unpleasant experience that I've had on the SNES to date. No contest, no question. I've never endured a game that's made me feel like I was wasting my time as much as this one did. The combat's slow as hell, hunting alchemy ingredients and exchanging money was tedious, and locking away so many important items behind a horrible side quest was just cruel. There are some great foundational ideas here that were totally hindered by questionable implementation. I had really high hopes for this, but I came away from it with nothing to show other than some hurt feelings and a new coaster.